Since ancient times, trade has connected peoples and even continents. Not only goods flowed along sea routes and caravan trails. Thanks to them, there was an exchange of experience, ideas, and new technologies between different countries and cultures. Already at the dawn of civilization, a merchant class emerged, a special group of people who were professionally engaged in trade. Speaking of the era of antiquity, the peak of trade relations came during the times of the Roman Empire. After its collapse, dark times began in Europe, which also affected trade relations. Commerce in the Middle Ages was a difficult and often dangerous business. However, merchants did not lose hope, and by the 15th century they had become leading figures, carriers of new relationships that eventually undermined the traditional foundations of feudalism. In this episode, we will talk about how medieval merchants lived, what and with whom they traded, and how their role in society changed from century to century. You will learn about powerful merchant alliances, as well as free trading cities that played a crucial role in the history of the Old World. In addition, we will talk about medieval bankers and the history of banking. My name is Semyon, and I declare the How Did They Live section open. Let's begin, editor. From the fall of Rome to the Renaissance in the early Middle Ages, trade was a difficult and extremely dangerous occupation. At that time, there was practically no central authority, and all of Europe was divided into the estates of feudal lords, each of whom was king and god on his own land. For passing through the territory of each feudal lord, a merchant had to pay a toll. For example, to transport goods along the entire length of the French Loire, you could end up paying a toll 74 times. And when the merchant finally reached the place of sale, it often turned out that he had spent much more money on tolls than on purchasing the goods themselves. They had to pay for using bridges and ferries, and besides, the quality of the roads themselves was simply terrible. And if the cart broke down and the goods fell to the ground, they became the property of the lord of that land. That's where the saying comes from, what falls off the cart is lost. And of course, traveling was unsafe. The roads were teeming with bandits, who were often the local feudal lords themselves. Merchants of the early Middle Ages had another serious problem. The overwhelming majority of the population lived in rural areas, practiced subsistence farming, and had almost no money. However, despite all the difficulties, trade did not stop during these challenging times. Because the nobility and the clergy, as well as broader segments of the population, needed various goods and products that were not produced locally, so they had to be brought in from other regions, and sometimes from very far away. And it was not only about luxury items or exotic curiosities, but also about more everyday goods, which were often delivered by merchants both by water and by land. The merchants of this period are particularly noteworthy. They were very different from their counterparts of the developed and late Middle Ages. These were enterprising, daring, and brave people who not only knew how to handle money well, but were also skilled with weapons. They often engaged in armed robbery or piracy at sea themselves. With the onset of the High Middle Ages, the natural economy began to be replaced by commodity money relations, crafts developed, cities grew, and roads became better and safer. In a word, life was improving, and with it, energy was gaining momentum. In the 11th century, the first merchant guilds appeared in cities. They protected the interests and privileges of the trading class. Usually, the guild included merchants from one city or those who traded in a specific type of goods. Guild members paid membership fees which were spent on common needs. For example, guilds often hired armed squads to protect caravans or build city fortifications. Members of the associations followed common rules, and breaking them led to punishment. These rules concerned buying and selling goods, markups, and competition between merchants. Deceiving your colleagues was strictly condemned. It was also considered unacceptable to greatly overprice goods unless there were serious reasons for it. At first, guilds were small associations, but their power grew rapidly, and soon independent merchants simply could not compete with the guilds. Large feudal lords, kings, and even the church itself had to take merchant unions into account. The 13th and the first half of the 14th century can be called the heyday of the merchant class. In many European cities, the merchant elite, who had amassed enormous wealth, exerted decisive influence over their governance. Although they made up only a small percentage of the urban population, merchants and entrepreneurs held all the power. They filled city councils, implemented tax policies favorable to themselves, and controlled the courts and local legislation. Some of the medieval merchants rose even higher. For example, the banker Jacques Coeur, who was called the first financial magnate of Europe, became the treasurer and minister of the French king Charles VII. He helped implement reforms and strongly influence French politics. However, when Coeur fell out of favor with the king, he had to flee and spend the rest of his life in exile. The thirst for profit and a spirit of adventure drove merchants not only into the whirlpool of palace intrigues, but also into distant and risky journeys. Here, it's enough to recall the famous Marco Polo. In 1291, the Genoese brothers Vivaldi decided to embark on a journey that, according to a contemporary, no one had dared to undertake before them. To sail around Africa and reach the fabled riches of India. The fate of the expedition is unknown, as no one ever saw their ships again. There are many such examples. Thanks to merchants, Europeans learned about silk, porcelain, paper, and possibly even gunpowder, things that were invented in the East. However, we should not idealize medieval merchants too much, because a merchant of that time could easily turn into a corsair. A similar story is told in the Decameron, where a merchant, after being robbed, turns to piracy himself and returns home a wealthy man. In the early Middle Ages, literacy was almost exclusively the privilege of the clergy, but from around the 13th century, the situation began to change rapidly. Commercial activity required a person to have serious training, including obtaining an education. An illiterate merchant could hardly conduct himself successfully in cities, not only in large ones but also in relatively small ones. Secular schools appeared, where merchants' children were taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. While theology was mainly studied in church schools, future merchants acquired knowledge for practical purposes. Special attention was paid to the study of mathematics and foreign languages. The children of business people eagerly went to the city's universities, and even special scholarships were established for them. Books began to appear in the homes of wealthy merchants of the late Middle Ages, once the exclusive possession of the clergy. Moreover, many merchants of that time kept their own records, noting not only their income and expenses, but also information about interesting events in distant cities and countries, as well as the customs of different peoples. Merchants of the late Middle Ages maintained active correspondence, and hundreds of thousands of business letters from that era have survived to this day. Trade routes and fairs, as well as large shipments of goods, were mainly transported by waterways in the Middle Ages. Merchants preferred river and sea routes, as they were cheaper and safer. The busiest trade movement, just like in ancient times, was across the Mediterranean Sea. It connected Europe with the countries of the East and Africa, and through it, Europeans received exotic goods such as silk, incense, carpets, and spices. For a long time, the main role in trade between Europe and the East was played by the Byzantines in Constantinople. Italian, French, Arab merchants and merchants from Rus would come there with their goods. In the 13th century, the decline of Byzantium began, and the main role in Mediterranean trade shifted to the merchants of the Italian cities of Venice and Genoa. The second European trade route passed through the North and Baltic Seas, connecting England, France, northern Germany, Flanders, the Scandinavian countries, Poland, the Baltic states, and Rus. Along this route, manufactured goods from Western Europe were transported to the east, while grain, timber, flax, hides, and slaves were brought back. There were also two important river trade routes. The first of them went from the Adriatic Sea along the Po River, through the mountain passes of the Alps to the Rhine River, and then to the North Sea. Along this route, goods from the Mediterranean, from southern Europe, made their way to northern Europe. Another route went through the Neva, Lovat, and Dnieper rivers from the Baltic Sea and then to Constantinople. In Rus, this road was called the route from the Varangians to the Greeks. The most important event in medieval Europe was the fairs. The first known fair was held in Saint-Denis near Paris in 629. By the 10th century, they had already become a widespread phenomenon. Medieval fairs were true centers of trade, craftsmanship, and culture. They were held in different cities and regions throughout the year and attracted merchants, craftsmen, and travelers from all over Europe and even from other parts of the world. At the fairs, people traded all kinds of goods, from food products to jewelry and exotic curiosities from the East. Here, people exchanged news and ideas, listened to musicians and troubadours, and made new acquaintances and connections. For safety reasons, fairs were usually held near city walls, close to monasteries, or near the castles of feudal lords. The patronage of an influential feudal lord, a clergyman, or a major city ensured safe passage, trade, and fair resolution of disputes for those coming to the fair. The landowners benefited greatly by collecting duties from visiting merchants. The most famous fairs were held in the province of Champagne, in Saint-Denis, Florence, Genoa, Milan, Frankfurt am Main, and Cologne. Besides fairs, markets were extremely popular in the Middle Ages. The lords organized them on their lands to collect duties from merchants. Many of these markets evolved into major trading centers, such as the markets of Rouen, Toulouse, and Reims. For example, according to contemporaries, the Gostiny Dvor in Paris resembled a real Eastern bazaar. Here they traded fabrics, food, clothing, and iron goods, exotic goods from the East, and spices. The relationship between society and the church. Medieval society was divided into three large groups: feudal lords and knights, those who fight; the clergy, those who pray; and peasants, those who till the land. As you can easily see, merchants did not have a place in this simple scheme, because the attitude toward merchants in those times was, to put it mildly, ambiguous. On the one hand, the usefulness of merchants for society was obvious, and even the church, the moral authority of that era, acknowledged it. But on the other hand, trade was considered a highly dubious and suspicious occupation, as it offered many opportunities for deception and unjust profit. Therefore, priests readily recalled the words of Ioan Zlatoust, "The merchant's craft is not pleasing to God." Thomas Aquinas noted, "There is something shameful in trade, while fully recognizing its necessity." The social prestige of merchants was quite low, since their honesty and integrity were seriously questioned. In the lists of occupations considered dishonorable and impure by the church, trade was constantly mentioned. The attitude of the nobility and knighthood toward merchants was even worse. In the feudal class society, noble birth and knightly valor were valued above all. A merchant, even a wealthy one, was met with the contempt of the nobles, since he was far from the knightly ideals in the eyes of knights and ladies. He was just a commoner, a scoundrel, who had gained his wealth through a dishonorable trade. On top of that, there was also plain envy, since many feudal lords were poor and constantly in need of money. It should be said that the negative attitude toward merchants was often quite justified. Many members of the merchant class did not choose their means to increase their income. They ruthlessly exploited their servants and workers, and did not shy away from outright fraud and deception. Fabulous profits for European merchants did not come from a program of trading Christian slaves. But the famous Petrarch complained about the huge number of slaves who filled the streets of Venice. Yes, merchants in the Middle Ages were openly disliked, but it was the moneylenders, dealers who lent people money at interest, who truly provoked the hatred of the masses. This kind of business was mainly conducted by Jews and Italian bankers, the Lombards. The church considered usury to be one of the most terrible sins, which would surely send a person's soul to hell. Priests refused to bury moneylenders in consecrated ground and cursed them in their sermons. According to the church, the fires of Gehenna threatened not only the moneylenders themselves, but even their children, if they agreed to use the ill-gotten money of their fathers. Such an attitude of the church toward moneylenders found wide support among ordinary people. In the 13th and 14th centuries, a wave of pogroms against Lombards and Jews swept across Europe, many of which ended in terrible massacres, Hanseatic League raids, and persecutions. At the end of the 12th and the beginning of the 13th century, European cities became powerful economic centers of the continent. Goods and money flowed here in a continuous stream, and along with them came new craftsmen and merchants. By this time, many cities had gained independence from feudal lords and self-government. Power in these cities was elected by the townspeople for a set term, which essentially made them republics. The richest and most influential among them were the German cities of Hamburg, Lübeck, Bremen, Nuremberg, as well as the Italian cities of Pisa, Florence, Bologna, Venice, and Genoa. Very quickly, merchants and their guilds gained the most influence in the independent cities, since they had the greatest financial resources. Over time, some city republics turned into strong independent states, and their power extended over large territories beyond the city itself. In the 12th and 13th centuries, powerful city republics such as Florence, Genoa, and Venice emerged in northern Italy. Florence controlled an entire region of Italy, the wealthy Tuscany. The trading city republics had their own armies and fleets. They established trading posts in distant lands, settlements and fortresses with docks, houses for merchants, warehouses for storing goods, and places for trade. Many of these settlements eventually turned into full-fledged cities. It can be said that nowhere in Europe did the merchant class achieve such economic and political power as in the cities of Italy. Nowhere else was such a wide segment of the population involved in trade. A traveler who passed through Venice shortly before the Great Plague came to a conclusion. Here, the whole city consists of merchants. Such a rapid rise of Italian cities was facilitated by a fortunate combination of several factors: Italy's advantageous geographical location, excellent climate, the presence of Roman traditions in trade and monetary relations, the openness and dynamism of society, as well as the presence of the papal court as a pan-European center of political life. The merchant mentality, which developed early and vividly in the favorable conditions of Italy, in turn contributed to its economic success. A significant milestone in the development of trade in Northern Europe was the creation of the Hanseatic League in the 13th century, an alliance of trading cities led by the German city of Lübeck. By the beginning of the 15th century, this league already included more than 100 cities, among which were Riga, Tallinn, Novgorod, and Pskov. The Hanseatic League conducted its own foreign policy, had a strong fleet and its own fortresses. Representatives of the League operated in major European cities: London, Paris, Venice. From the middle of the 15th century, the gradual decline of the Hanseatic League began. It finally lost its influence after the discovery of new sea routes to colonial countries. Medieval bankers. I have already mentioned the extremely negative attitude toward usury in medieval society. However, despite public anger and the church's disapproval, this trade survived and flourished. The predecessors of bankers were money changers, who exchanged different types of currencies at fairs and markets. The benches they sat on were called banco in Italian, which is where the modern word bank comes from. Money changers did not limit themselves to exchanging money, they also handled money transfers and usury. Later, lending money at interest was monopolized by Jews, and after their expulsion from England and France, by Italians. Interestingly, another organization stood at the origins of banking in Europe, the Order of the Templars. The Knights were the first to come up with issuing travelers' checks, which could be cashed at any office of the order. They exchanged currencies and accepted money for safekeeping. They were even the first to verify documents using fingerprints. In addition, the Knights lent money at interest, despite their church status. Moreover, while Jews gave loans at an exorbitant 40% with the Templars, you could borrow at just 10%. Banking operations made the order fabulously rich, which eventually led to its downfall. The Roman popes repeatedly threatened severe punishments for those who gave loans with interest and released debtors from their obligations to creditors. In 1179, at the Third Lateran Council, Pope Alexander III declared that those guilty of charging interest should be denied communion and a Christian burial. The Church's bans on usury, of course, complicated financial activities, but it was mainly small moneylenders who suffered from them. Large banks easily bypassed all obstacles, and no wonder. They lent money to nobles, kings, and even the Roman popes. For example, Florentine bankers lent money to English kings. Only thanks to their financial support were the British able to conquer Wales, Scotland, and then start the 100 Years' War. Over time, even the Church began to view usury more leniently. In the 15th century, Florentine bankers like Medici, Pazzi, and Strozzi became bankers to the Roman popes. Essentially, this meant that all the enormous revenues of the Vatican passed through their hands. In the end, merchants never managed to become part of the feudal hierarchy or to be accepted by the nobility and knighthood. However, as they gained more and more power and influence, they were able to shatter the old feudal world and bring Europe into a new era. It was the merchant class that stood at the origins of capitalism in the old world, which allowed Europeans to begin global expansion and change the face of our planet. That's all from me. See you in the next episode. Bye.